Hello, everyone. Welcome back to OTD Military History. Sorry about the delay. We're having some technical difficulties on both of our ends, so all good to go. Everyone's good to go here. Sorry, I apologize, but the other show had some wires crossed. It's been that kind of week, I think, for both of us. So thanks, everyone, for hanging with us and popping on now. So today, excited to talk about this topic and to have our guest on today, Anna Reid. This is a subject I've been wanting to talk about on the channel for a long time, just haven't had the I don't know, inspiration or spark or a video or whatever to do it. So this is really our chance to do it. So I'll bring in Anna here real quick. Hi, Anna. Thank you for coming on the channel and agreeing to talk about your book. Excited to have you on here.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. I'm honored to be with you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. So as I just asked, and as a lot of my regular viewers know, my first question in these types of live streams is always, why this subject? Why write a whole book on, I guess we can call it the Western intervention, Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War in Russia? It goes by many titles. Kind of why something that a lot of people don't know a ton about? Why this particular topic?
Well, it's not well-trodden ground already. Which is obviously always a big advantage. It's always nice to be breaking fresh ground and not just sort of refreshing and updating other people's work. And the reason it hasn't been written about much before, in the West at least, is because, of course, it was such a humiliating flop. It totally failed, this effort to overthrow the new Bolshevik government. So at the time, it was sort of swept under the carpet. There was no official history written, no campaign medals issued, and all the sort of top brass and the politicians involved distanced themselves or sort of wrote as little about it as possible in their memoirs, or blame shifted. And it did get rather forgotten. It was sort of elided with the war against Germany, which is something you can see actually in war memorials. I don't know about Canada, but in England certainly, where you've got all the the names and where they fell and the familiar names from Belgium and France. And then you get an odd Russian name like sort of Murmansk and a weird date like 1919. And you think, what was that all about? And you realize that this man, he wasn't fighting the Germans, he was fighting the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of just go off that. That's kind of one of the reasons I've always wanted to talk about this subject. It's fascinating because I think it was a couple of years ago, I found footage of, I think it's in Vladivostok. I can't remember exactly. I think so. Anyway, they had all the troops that were representing all the nations in one long panning shot. And it's just fascinating because they have them all intermixed. Like Italians are sitting next to Americans, are sitting next to Japanese, and Canadians are mixed in there with the Brits. And it's a fascinating little piece of footage. So, I mean, in Canada, it's obviously not as well known as the First World War, but I mean, it comes up a little bit because I was reading part of the book this morning, and you talk about how, and we can get in, I want to talk about like the troops experience a little bit later, because I want to talk about kind of the bigger picture first, is, who was going and where and when and all of that stuff. So it comes up a little bit. I mean, you have to kind of be paying attention, but it's a fascinating one. So kind of the first question I wanted to ask is, can you just kind of give us a quick overview of why this happens? Because not everybody knows what happened and why, and kind of a quick brief overview would be great.
So you can see it as a sort of prototype for failed liberal interventions later on. And participants interviewed in old age often compared it to Vietnam, and in our own times it's very reminiscent of Afghanistan in particular. And well, it starts off as an effort to revive the Eastern Front. So the war against Germany is still going on. The end of 1917, the provisional government, which has taken over, it's a sort of centre-left civilian government, has taken over from Tsar Nicholas II and done its best to keep the war effort going. It collapses. There's a coup. The Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, launch a successful coup against it, November 1917, and they immediately start peace talks with the Germans, which was one of their great slogans. It was land, bread, peace, and these progress through the winter of 1917-18 to the Allies' dismay, as you can imagine, because this means, prospect if Russia stops, and already the Russian armies were collapsing.
Yeah.
But if the new regime in Russia actually makes a formal peace with Germany, this means that Germany can transfer divisions west, and it raises the prospect of Germany having access to Russian wheat, Russian oil down in the Caspian, Russian coal from the Donbass, from the eastern Ukraine, and so on. And so we don't really care who takes power in Russia at this stage. We're so desperate, basically anybody who's prepared to carry on fighting the Germans. So to start with, the Allies, so when after the Bolshevik coup, you get lots of new governments, in inverted commas, declaring themselves. Usually it's just some committee of, to 20 people in some provincial city. But they, like a couple of dozen different so-called governments, declare themselves round the edges of the old Russian Empire. And some of the national governments, like Georgian, Azerbaijani, Ukrainian, Estonian, or whatever, some are rival revolutionary governments, and others are sort of outright monarchist governments wanting to, to go back to the old days, and every sort of everything in between.
Yeah.
And we back them all. We send our military intelligence guys off to all of them, suss out which we think are most viable, and start sending several of them money. Even often when they themselves are rivals, they themselves are fighting each other. There's an anti-Bolshevik front is never created despite our best efforts. So that's the beginning of it, sort of through 1918, while the war against Germany is still going on. And then, of course, with the armistice, with Germany's defeat, that all those worries about Russian wheat and oil and so on going to Germany, all those all disappear. But by that time we're stuck in. We've made promises, we've made commitments, we've sent troops, and the rationale for carrying on becomes ideological. So there's a massive, with the end of the First World, with the end of the war against Germany, censorship is lifted, all those sort of wartime restrictions lifted, and there's a massive, great wave of demonstrations and strikes and so on in Paris, London, all the big American cities, and it looks to the right as though this is revolution spreading west, although this is sort of all one, the Bolsheviks behind it, it's all one big plot. And it's felt that, if the Bolsheviks can be overthrown, that not only will make Russia a better place, but it will make the West a safer place as well.
Yeah, I mean that was an excellent overview. Thank you. That is kind of the sense I get from it is this shift from obviously keep pressure on the Germans to the east, keeping that up. But then it kind of leads me to my next question is how it evolves, right? Because you said it starts from this almost war necessity to keep a front up against the enemy, and then moves kind of ideologically. So I was wondering, and this might be more complicated than it seems, but who is kind of the key drivers? Is there a key political personality that is giving up starts the idea to say, hey, we got to keep Russia in the fight, and then does that change to another leader that wants to keep that going as it moves toward a more ideological front? Is it the same group of people, or does it change throughout?
Well, initially, amongst the Allied leaders, the fiercest, most in favour of intervention, is Clemenceau of France,
right.
Who, despite himself, having a lifelong socialist and anti-establishment figure. I mean, he'd had this long career. He was already in his 70s, and he had spent time in jail as a young man for writing sort of radical, radical journalism.
Yeah.
And organising demonstrations and so on. He'd also been in exile in the States for a while. But he'd also lived through the Paris Commune, and he saw what violent radicalism did, and he saw these horrible tit-for-tat atrocities and mass executions and so on both sides. And so he had an absolute loathing of outright revolution and of what was happening in Russia. And also, of course, a big chunk of France was occupied. It had lost more of its young men than any of the other allies. And it was the most, and also not least, a lot of French savers, small savers, had put their money into Russian bonds, into Tsarist era Russian bonds. And the new government, the Lenin-Trotsky government, they reneged on them. They said, we're not going to honor these Tsarist era bonds. And this was actually a massive financial blow for France. And so these three things, these three factors together meant that France and the French in general were the most furious and angry, and felt the most betrayed at this crazy new radical government coming in Russia, and they saw Russia dropping out of the war as this sort of heinous betrayal. And then at the sort of the other end of the spectrum, we've got Woodrow Wilson of America, who had been very unwilling to enter the war against Germany. He only declared war on Germany at the beginning of 1917, in outright contradiction of his sort of manifesto promises in the previous election. And it took massive diplomatic pressure to get him to contribute troops to the intervention. And then Lloyd George of Britain sort of was somewhere in the middle, and he tended to sort of be pulled this way and that. He was never very convinced about the intervention, but he let himself be sort of carried along with it, and his views on it tended to change depending on what was happening militarily. He'd get more positive when things seemed to be going well, and then when things went badly, he said, "I always thought it was a terrible idea."
Well, it just sounds like Lloyd George for everything else, so that's not surprising. Because that's kind of where I wanted to, not with Lloyd George, because I think he's fairly well known, and his thought process is more Wilson, because to me, and if I'm wrong, please correct me, but like you said, and I've read about this a little bit, the American reluctance to really do more after the armistice. But as far as I understood, and kind of Wilson's principles and the 14 points and everything like that, this sort of, I don't know if it would fall under it in his eyes, so I'd be interested in your thoughts. But that collective defense, that new kind of liberal intervention, like you talked about, is that part of this, or did he see this as something else? If you even looked into that at all.
Well, what really changed his mind in the spring of 1918 was the Czech Legion.
Okay.
It's a complicated story. So going back a little bit. So what's now the Czech Republic was, of course, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. However, the Czech national movement was already well established by the time the First World War breaks out. And Czechs are willy-nilly conscripted into the Austrian army, and mostly very unhappily, because they see themselves as being forced to fight on behalf of their oppressors, their sort of colonial power. So there are mass Czechs defect, whole regiments at a time of Czechs defect to the Russian side during the First World War. So come 1917 and the sort of 1917-18 and the collapse of the Russians, the Bolshevik takeover and the collapse of the Russian army, the Czechs they're a large military force. They don't collapse. They stick to their troop trains, hang on to their weapons, maintain their discipline.
Yep. And
their first thought is now to get home and join in the liberation of what became Czechoslovakia. And they can't travel westwards.Ed can't take the short way home because the war's still going on and Germany and Austria are in the way. So instead, they head east on their trains. You get these dozens of Czech troop trains carrying about 50,000 men heading all the way east, thousands of miles to Vladivostok, with the aim of taking ship there and sailing back halfway around the world to Europe. And as in the spring of 1918, when they're spread out along the Trans-Siberian, Trotsky loses his nerve and decides that they are a threat and issues orders to the little Soviets, these little sort of new self-declared town councils in all these little railway towns along the Trans-Siberian. He says, you need to disarm the Czechs. I want you to disarm them, break them up, and just conscript the Czech soldiers into my new Red Army. Czechs get wind of this, obviously having none of it, and they decide to then fight their way east, which they do. And in short order, in about a couple of months, they take over the entire Trans-Siberian. They topple all these little scratch militias on all the railway towns, and they've got control of, what is North Asia's sort of major strategic transport sort of artery. And so this, as you can imagine, hits the headlines around the world. And it's a great romantic story, these lovers of liberty, making their way thousands of miles east so they can come back home and help liberate their countrymen. And it appeals to Woodrow Wilson's imagination. They are one of the small determining nations of his 14 points speech. And it catches the imagination of the public as well. And that's what really swings him round and decides him to initially, the first big thing they do is contribute troops to a big multinational expedition up to the north, up to Archangel and Murmansk.
Yeah, I mean, I knew it had a little bit to do with it. It's coming back to me now, remembering kind of some notes he'd scribbled on something that I saw in an undergrad class a long time ago. Don't want to say how long ago, but a while ago. That's just kind of one of the things that comes in my head is all of these, because we have the sidebar comments and everything. It's people are talking about the various different threads, and there are so many here. It's hard to kind of keep track of who's kind of having the motivations of what they're trying to do, and then obviously I think there's a clear change with the armistice and everything like that. So it's a fascinating kind of thread to look at. So that kind of leads to my next question as well. When you were researching the book, was there any sort of, how do I say this, the higher ups, like the national leaders, was there anything that sort of surprised you with the positions they took even in various parts of this whole time period?
The intervention, it reflects very badly on Churchill. It's a black sort of spot in his career. So he gets back into the cabinet after the war, after the armistice. Yep. Lloyd George brings him. He's been in disgrace after the Dardanelles disaster. Lloyd George, after the war with Germany is over, brings him back into the cabinet as Minister for War, with the main task of demobilizing as quickly as possible and getting all the army costs down, getting back to normal life. And Churchill, however, I mean, if one's cynical, one thinks that, he was desperate to, I mean, the people like Andrew Roberts will dispute this, but I mean, my reading of it rather is that he was desperate. He saw himself as a military man. He loved war. He loved warfare. He found it incredibly exciting. And stimulating, and he wanted to retrieve his military reputation. And with the war proper over, the one remaining field for doing this was Russia. And he was also an ardent anti-Bolshevik. He was a conservative. So back in the war cabinet, he becomes the cheerleader for continuing the intervention. And it's to such an extent that the newspapers start calling it Mr. Churchill's private war. And the intervention in the north, up in Archangel and Murmansk, is wound up because that there've been mutinies, both amongst the Russian troops that we've been helping to train, but also amongst British and American troops. I mean, mutinies puts it rather strongly. Soldier strikes is a more
like a sit-down protest type thing.
Yeah, sitting down protest. We're told to, attack such and such a village, and just sitting down and saying no. We think it's a bad idea, and this is why. This is our petition. Or refusing to get back into their trains to return to the front after R&R back in Archangel. That happened a lot with the French, the British, and the Americans. So that bit of the intervention is wound up. But at the same time, Churchill advocates extremely strongly for a new intervention, a whole new campaign down in the south, because the Black Sea is now open to the Allied navies.
Right.
So they go through the Dardanelles, and from sort of March of 1919 onwards, we're sending thousands of tanks, trucks, guns, thousands of tons of medical supplies and uniforms and food and everything else to Denikin, who is the political and military leader in the south of these different white armies. And and they land at Novorossiysk, which is in the news now because it's become Putin's naval base in the Black Sea, the Crimea having become too dangerous. And so you've got these massive amounts of equipment all landing in Novorossiysk, and then then there's a big effort to get it distributed, to get the Russians trained on it, to keep it maintained, and so on. There's also an RAF squadron down there helping bomb all the way up the Volga to Tsaritsyn, later Stalingrad, now Volgograd. So the man behind this is Churchill, and he refuses to listen to bad news coming from the ground by the actual British officers on the ground. I mean, who America's out of it, the whole thing by now. It's got some ships in the Black Sea, but they're just ferrying humanitarian aid and refugees. And I mean, it's sort of, the general pattern is that some a regular army officer, a career officer, will sign up to go to Russia after the war with Germany's over, because this is an opportunity for more active service, more promotion, promotion chances. And he's not ideological. He's just doing it for career reasons. And he lands. He lands in Russia, lands in Novorossiysk or Sevastopol or wherever, and he goes and checks in with his HQ, and then he goes and checks in with his Russian opposite numbers, who he's supposed to be liaising with and cooperating with and supplying. And they are generally pretty much straight away extremely disillusioned by take a quite strong dislike to their Russian opposite numbers. And for good reasons. So they take a dislike to us also for good reasons. So I mean, broadly speaking, we think that they're drunk, disorganized, and reactionary, and they think that we are arrogant, condescending, and naive, and ignorant, totally ignorant of Russia, obviously. And everybody's correct, and all these criticisms are completely justified. But when this is passed on to the War Office. And most of it doesn't get past this man called Holman, General Holman, who's in charge of the military mission in the south, because he's absolutely committed. He's a very right wing, very blinkered, very unrealistic. I mean, he's a bad officer. He's disliked by pretty much everybody. But none of these bad impressions make their way up to Whitehall, or if they do, Churchill doesn't listen to them. And of course, what he turns a blind eye to, most shockingly, is the pogroms, is the white pogroms. Yeah,
that's well, I was going to say there's so many things here that are not discussed, and that's one of them. But yeah, I want to come back to that, but I have some questions from the audience first, with some more little high level, and then we'll move into a little more detailed stuff. And this is something I don't know, but this is a good question. So, did the Bolsheviks at any point try to, mollify the Western allies and the Japanese to not intervene or to leave? Was there anything done in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely, there was. So the first few months of 1918, the Bolsheviks are basically sort of walking a tightrope because they're terrified of intervention. They expect a massive intervention. I mean, much, much bigger than what actually happened. They couldn't believe how small it was, how half-hearted it was when we do eventually land troops.
Right.
So through the sort of spring, early summer of 1918, they're in talks with the Germans, but they're also keeping the Allies on side. And they give the actual ambassadors have been withdrawn because they haven't got we don't give the new regime diplomatic recognition, but you get these junior figures who mostly sort of previously were sort of consuls or even sort of Red Cross representatives and so on, maintaining or sort of, building contacts, and they are given flattering amounts of face time by Lenin and Trotsky, given sort of rides on Trotsky's famous armored train and all this kind of thing, and are generally, not everybody, but generally quite starstruck. And the promise is always held out to them that these talks with Germany, they're just a temporary, necessity, and we realize this peace with Germany, which lets Germany occupy the whole of Ukraine. It's a beggar's peace, and we'll reverse it and go back to war with them as soon as we can. And but that breaks down. That breaks down in June when there are big landings at Archangel, and the Bolsheviks then make mass arrests. They basically arrest all the expats in Moscow and Petersburg, with the exception of the Americans, because they know that Wilson is less keen on the intervention.
Yeah,
and they,
right, okay, yeah.
hope that maybe they can break America away from France and Britain.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I was going to say there's so many threads here, and this leads to a related question. I was going to say the other side, but it's not quite so simple, but known as collectively as the whites, do they ever even have a ultimate unified objective?
They don't really. This was one of their big failings, that they don't have a political program. And Denikin, who's the last sort of his is the last sort of force left standing at the beginning of 1920. I mean, he refuses to come up with a political program, particularly on land reform. I mean, this is we get these the officers on the ground. They make a point, or the sort of more intellectually curious of them make a point of chatting to the locals, the local peasants,
okay,
who gather round. When they're accompanying the Russian army on its sort of advances and retreats, and a nice example is a man called Kennedy, and he talks about how the first question on all the peasants' lips is always, are we going to be allowed to keep our land?
Right, okay.
First of all, they say, first of all, they tell him the Reds are just as bad as the Whites. The Reds were here, last week, and they took all our chickens and our cattle and our potatoes, and now you're doing the same. And the second thing they say is, are we going to be allowed to keep our land? And this is land they've expropriated from the big landowners, year and a half previously during the revolution. It was a bit like sort of farm occupations in South Africa. They would just move in and start farming the land, and the landowning family sometimes sort of moved to a little cottage in the grounds and hung on in there, sort of keeping their heads down, sort of more often fled. But there was no answer for them, because Denikin refused to come up with any land reform program or any other sort of program. And so he hid behind this, I'm an honest soldier. Politics aren't for me. Politics will await victory. And it wasn't enough.
No, I mean, you see this in other places as well at this time too, right? Because it tends to be not even outside of Russia and other places in Europe, especially, but elsewhere. It's a far more complicated time than I think a lot of people are aware of this. And this is why I wanted to talk about this, and having your book and you on here is one of the reasons. Is I like adding complications, and this is a big one. So one more kind of high level political one, and then I want to kind of move more to the experiences of those who were there. And I don't know about this one. I have no idea. If you could, this is from one of our good supporters of the channel. Can Anna talk about the anarchist support for the Bolsheviks and how that may have played into the intervention?
The best known of the anarchist warlords was a man called Nestor Makhno in Ukraine. And there's an awful lot of rubbish talked about him. Now, there's been an awful lot of myth making, and there are an awful lot of tall stories. If you've read Pavstovsky, there's a very good new translation of his. It's a memoir.
Okay.
And he was a writer, and he was in Ukraine at the time. He was in Kiev, and then he moved down to Odessa. But he stayed. He didn't leave. But I mean, they didn't last. I mean, they were knocked out one by one.
Right.
All the lesser players by the Red Army. So, I mean, they rampaged around. I mean, Makhno, he was at his most powerful in 1919 when there was Germany withdrew from Ukraine, which had been allowed to occupy had been able to occupy under the peace treaty with Lenin and Trotsky. And this left behind, so that they withdraw at the end of 1918, beginning of 1919. This leaves a massive power vacuum, and you get all these armies piling in. So you've got the Red Army, You've got Denikin's White Army, you've got the new Polish Army, you've got two separate Ukrainian national armies, and then you've got a bunch of warlords, one of them Machno. He's not the most powerful. And they rampage around, basically, sort of massacring and looting, until one by one, basically the Red Army knocks them out.
Okay, so that doesn't really have how do you say this? That humanitarian element, I know that's kind of modern language applied backwards a little bit, but does that have a concern amongst anybody in the West about, hey, maybe we need to go for that as well because of this total anarchy that has literally broken out in some areas? We carry on sending aid to Denikin, officially, so that he can take control and restore order, and he does indeed take control of most of Ukraine for a bit, but he certainly does not restore order. His army is. The scapegoated by everybody are Jews. The whole civil war is characterized by most appalling atrocities against civilians, and prisoners of war also. So mass executions of prisoners of war, mass hangings of people who are suspected of being against you, being sympathetic to the other side. Mass requisitioning of food and burning of villages as you retreat to deny shelter to the enemy. Burning of villages which are suspected of sympathizing with the enemy, it's just horrible. That it's a hideous war, but it's scapegoated by everybody are Jews. And you've got and all those armies that I just listed, everybody massacres and mass rapes Jews. And Ukraine has got lots of shtetl towns, and it's part of the old Pale settlement, so it's the population's sort of 8 to 10% Jewish, and in some places it's sort of 40-50% Jewish. And the whites, and the whites amongst them, and we, the Brits, who are the only allies left there by sort of the second half of 1919, when the white pogroms peak, we turn an absolute blind eye. And the military on the ground, they either when Jewish organizations complain or come up with petitions, they say, "Oh, these excesses," this was the euphemism of the time, "these excesses are exaggerated, or the reports are simply untrue. It's Bolshevik propaganda." Or another one is victim blaming. It's the Jews' fault for supporting the revolution. Jew equals Bolshevik. That in fact was the centerpiece of white propaganda. In place of an actual political program, everything was blazed on the Jews. Jews made the revolution, and every Jew is a revolutionary. And this was a sort of, and although this was sort of incredibly obviously untrue, indeed quite a lot of the Bolshevik leadership did have Jewish heritage, but that did not mean that every Jew was a revolutionary. Right. A lot of them had actually volunteered for the white armies right at the beginning. It is. I found it extraordinarily shameful, actually. I know the pogroms. It's about, we think, maybe 150,000 people were killed in the pogroms, or not, either directly or died of injuries or sort of exposure and hunger later, having been driven out of their towns. But I found it extraordinarily shameful, and even though it's long overshadowed the Holocaust more than a century ago. How even in Westminster as well, the sort of petitioners were turned away by senior civil servants. They said, "No, we don't think we should be allowed you to to go to Denikin with a deputation. No, it's not a good time." Or none of that surprising.
And Churchill sort of just denied that anything was happening in Parliament. or if there were occasional, sort of unfortunate incidents, this wasn't Denikin's fault. He was doing his best to stop it, which was patently untrue.
Yeah, it's, again, we're just adding more layers to this one because there's questions in the side there about this and connecting, or is this part of older programs and all of that. And obviously then you have that thread through of, Jews as Bolsheviks through to Nazi Germany, but we're not going to talk about that today. But it's just something that a lot of us are aware of. So, and there's one, because I want to keep moving. I want to talk about the next part is kind of the experience of those who were there, right? You talked about briefly, that the officer, what's the word I'm looking like, representative officer who gets disillusioned. What about the rank and file? Were you able to look at, the various countries and perhaps some of the non-English speaking countries of kind of what their experiences were like, say the rank and file?
There are particularly good collections of American private soldiers. And thanks to the University of Michigan, which put a lot of effort into collecting private papers. Right. And so they arrive in Europe thinking that they're going to go and fight the Kaiser. Right. And then they discover they're actually being sent to Russia to, as they see it, restore the Tsar, who was not a popular figure in America or indeed anywhere much abroad. Yep. Because people hadn't forgotten the Bloody Sunday 1905 when he shot at unarmed protesters. And of course his wife was German, so she was often, she was a sort of suspicious figure. Yeah. So they were extremely unhappy about it. And their letters at the time and their memoirs afterwards, they're pretty much they're very consistent in just saying it was, this was a misbegotten waste of lives and time and money. But another problem for them, is they came under British command in the north. The north was where the Americans did actual fighting. Yep. And they resented coming under British command. And also you've got this natural friction between the British troops and the American troops, in that the Americans were young, physically fit, but completely green. They hadn't, they were basically civilians in uniform. They'd had a few weeks sort of basic training. Whereas the Brits were unfit. They were category B or C troops. They'd often been gassed, or they were convalescent, or they had short sight or whatever. But they were experienced. And so the Brits tend to, so the Americans felt they were being sort of pushed to the front, and the Brits were taking what were known as swivel chair duties in the rear. Okay. Or doing nice sort of admin-y sort of jobs. And this wasn't actually true, actually. There were plenty of British troops in the thick of the fighting as well. But, the resentments brewed. Another big factor, actually, which Ironside, the general in charge in the north, keeps coming back to in his diaries, is the whiskey. So the American army was officially dry because prohibition was in force. The messes, there was no alcohol in your mess. No ration of alcohol or anything. Whereas the British army was excessively well supplied. Yeah. In the officers' case, with whiskey. And this actually caused sort of quite a lot of bad feeling, because the Americans were always sort of cadging. The Brits were always selling them stuff, under the counter, as you can imagine. The supply officers, sort of, these sort of the supply people would sort of, end up absolutely awash with cash, and there's all this whiskey they'd sold on the side. So it was never a happy. The British-American relationship in the north was never all that happy.
Yeah. Question from the sidebar, and we talked about it at the beginning, but we kind of moved away from it. Is the French? Where are the French soldiers? Are they involved? Are they fighting for an extended period of time at all?
There's French soldiers up in the north. Who are praised, actually. They're colonial. They're used to fighting in French possessions in Africa and Asia. So they're good at this sort of guerrilla warfare, sort of in the woods. Yeah. Used to it. And there's where the French have their real disaster is down in the south, in Sebastopol and Odessa. Okay. So when the defeat of Germany opens up the Black Sea, Britain and France basically divvy it up between them. So Britain takes the sort of eastern half and France takes the western half. And so France occupies Odessa and Sebastopol in Crimea, just to Odessa's east. And only a few months later, it flees again. It has to evacuate sort of chaotically,
right?
Because of a Ukrainian warlord. It's not the Red Army; it's just one of the warlords approaches and attacks Odessa. And these French, it's French Senegalese troops. It's most of the troops are Senegalese, actually, or they're Greek as well, but under French command. And they post haste retreat in awful chaos with sort of, screaming crowds of refugees on the quaysides and, shots whizzing over the decks of the ships and people sort of cutting their hawsers and steaming away with sort of people frantic people hanging off the gangplanks and, some people left behind. It's a really shamefully sort of botched, panicky evacuation. And then that's followed, even worse, by a outright mutiny on 2 French ships in Sebastopol, and it's right in front of the British ships. There's a bunch of different ships in the harbour, and the French ones, they run up, they pull down the tricolor, they run up the red flag, and several hundred French sailors row ashore and actually join in a pro-Bolshevik demonstration, local demonstration, on the quayside, and sort of march around the quayside as part of this sort of Russian pro-red demonstration. And they're brought back under control. So the Greek troops don't join in, fire on the demonstration. The French sailors are then sort of taken prisoner. But at this point, the French and they're sailed back home. Right. But this is all ignominious, as you can imagine, for France. Yeah. So actually, the country that was most keenest on intervention to start with actually becomes the first to drop out entirely. And then Clemenceau, he puts his chips on the Poles instead. He moves to a buffer state policy. He gives up. He thinks the whites it's not going to work. Right. And it's instead a cordon sanitaire. That's the new policy. So build up friendly buffer states round communist Russia.
Yeah, and then that's been talked about a bit in the side here is what's going on in Poland as well, and it's so many things to keep track of what's happening here. I don't want to forget, this is something about the U.S. Do you happen to know the casualties that the Americans suffered?
Ooh.
Can't be very many.
It's not. It's all together British and American and French. It's not. It's very low. It's like 2,000 or something.
Yeah, it can't be many.
It's not very many at all, and a lot of them are actually in accidents.
Yeah.
Or from typhus or Spanish flu.
Yeah.
So actual people killed in actual fighting, is the numbers compared to the war against Germany, absolutely tiny.
Yeah, because I looked at this a little bit because I know what I used to do is events of every day of Canadian military history, and one of them for a while was looking at it was a Canadian battery. It was a tiny little beast, but that's what they talk about is they don't take any combat casualties. The ones out in the East take none. They don't even see any combat. They just get sick and want to go home because they're sick. It's such an interesting way in a difference of the First World War, right? Because it's mostly battle casualties.
It's nothing like the First World War.
Yeah, it's not even.
It's a completely different sort of war. It's very, very mobile.
Yes.
And it's not intensive. You don't have any big set piece battles. And most of the time, it's sort of guerrilla war. It's in and out of little villages. On the steppe or up in the forests. Or sort of paddle steamers. Sort of chugging up and down rivers sort of with naval guns, or these wonderful armed train duels as well, where you sort of you look out for your your opposing train sort of puff of steam, sort of rising above the treetops, and then you fire at it, and then they fire back, and it's hard to hit them. So not many people get killed.
I guess that makes sense.
Typhus was the biggest killer, and the Spanish flu. I mean, there was no vaccination for typhus at that stage, and obviously lice were a big problem.
Yes, so that is similar to the. I don't know this, but were there any Western troops buried in Russia that died?
Yes, indeed. So it was interesting. So the American policy was to bring back, even back then, it was to bring back all the fallen. And there was a commission that was able to go to the north. I think it went sort of 2 or 3 times through the 20s and even into the early 30s. And it was able to bring back the remains. The British policy, however, was to leave people where they were. And so there are some little sort of neatly kept war cemeteries with those, those standard little round-topped white gravestones. But there are also quite a lot of unmarked ones. So I travelled through the various sort of villages along the river Dvina and the Varga and so on up in the north, and people would be showing us around, and you can still see some of the blockhouses. You can see the remains of the trenches. People go out and collecting shells. So these people, locals, they'll take you out the back to their garden shed and show you all these old shell casings that they've picked up. But also they changed the cemetery. In a couple of places, I was taken to what they called the English corner, the Angiski Ugel of the cemetery. And this was just an empty space. There was nothing left of any grave marker because the markers they'd put up at the time would have been wood and they'd long ago rotten away. Yeah. But the locals had not dug up the graves and not buried anyone else there. They'd just left these little corners of the cemeteries empty. And actually one sort of battlefield archaeologist in Archangel, he took me off to the sort of railway front below Archangel, which is fascinating. You can tell where that actually was sort of First World War style fighting because it was static and the two sides did dig themselves in and built big networks of trenches and shelled each other quite intensively. You can see the trees are slightly shorter in this sort of the no man's land in between because all the trees are knocked down. But he has dug up some remains actually. And he found an Australian Victoria Cross holder. A man called Pierce. He found his remains, and it is definitely him. I mean, he thought it was him when he saw him because he had one of those wonderful Australian hats, with the one side turned up and the other turned down. And I think he's actually done DNA testing on him now. Okay. With the cooperation of his relatives, and they had a ceremony and so on in Australia. So yeah, I mean there are still some remains still out there, but that grave that he discovered had been completely lost. It had been built over. It was on the edge of a village, and he was able to locate it because of some old photograph, and he was able basically to triangulate from sort of 3 buildings that were still there, like a water tower, I don't know, the railway station and something else. And then he got permission to dig, which was now somebody's garden, and there he found the remains.
That's amazing because again from the Commonwealth, right, with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, that was the rule, bury as close as possible to where they fell, and stay there in perpetuity. So it's obviously the political situation in Russia has changed, as we all know, multiple times since then. So it's interesting to see. You probably don't know of what's kind of going on in that regard, because I can only imagine it's quite frosty trying to deal with that today. So, and that's been like that several times. So it's interesting to think about. Yeah,
it's interesting. I don't know what would have happened to what's happening now to those graveyards. They're quite sort of quiet and tucked away, and mostly local people don't really know about them. I suspect they're just sitting there and they're fine. I doubt they've been vandalized or anything. I may be, but I'd suspect not.
I don't know. Yeah, if they're.
I don't think, to be honest, people much care. It's too long ago. It's not a sort of hot issue.
Yeah. Yeah, that was kind of going to be my next question in two parts, as I tend to like to do these things. Because you mentioned the French straight out mutiny. Was there anything else in your research? Any of the could be the English speaking ones. Did they kind of express sympathy for maybe not the Bolsheviks, but maybe the common people and what they're going through? Is that a theme that you noticed?
Oh, absolutely, yes, very much. Yes, and people had people, so they were billeted. They got, you were generally billeted with local peasant families. In a sort of 2-room cottage, and so people got to know. Despite the language barrier, people got to. There was lots of interaction between them, and so one mustn't romanticize it. Obviously, so for example, one British sort of sergeant in charge of transport, he said that the first 2 words of Russian he learned were horse and now.
I remember reading that. Yeah,
grabbing, just requisitioning people's animals. But on the other hand, you also see lots in people's diaries. You see that people have, they make a big effort, and this is the private soldier, not just the officers. They make a big effort to learn Russian, and they write down the phonetic Russian for sort of cup and spoon, and they write down the and sort of plate, and they write down the names of all the children in the families they're staying with, and they show them sort of how their kit works. They show them how a sort of all these novelties work, like a torch or a watch. And they take people for their first ever ride in a car and that kind of thing. So they have great respect for them. They're very intrigued by sort of things like sleds, and people draw different designs of sleds. So this is a transport sled, and this is a sort of baggage sled, and or things like different types of well or the samovars and things like that. And they're very impressed by just how sort of tough and resourceful and skilled Russian peasants are. And again and again, you get people saying it's incredible how they can build a blockhouse or build a bridge just with an axe and nothing else, no other tools. And we don't need the corps of engineers, because these guys do it much quicker and better. And of course, there's a lot of pity for the refugees.
Yes,
you get these 2 great refugee flights. East along the Trans-Siberian and south down to Novorossiysk, along the railways at the end of the Civil War, when the whites are beaten, and the conditions on the refugee trains are absolutely horrendous, and corpses are thrown out at every stop, and the great piles of them in sidings and on platforms, and they talk about like you get lots of like about the refugee train which is sitting next to your train in the station. There's sort of frozen excrement, sort of sticking the refugee train to the ground. There's sort of stalactites of frozen excrement, and and the faces of the people horrible and emaciated and sort of horror struck and lost all hope. And so there's a lot of sympathy for them, and people try and help. Quite a lot of the interventionists, they've made friends amongst the Russians, and they'll help. They do their best to help people get out, and there's a bit of sort of informal distribution of food aid and that kind of thing as well, and medical aid.
Yeah, well, this is a connected. I'm sorry, I just lost it. Keep going too fast. And this could be kind of connected to it as well. Were any of the White Russians evacuated with the, I guess you could say, the Allies leaving, or were refugees taken with them at all, or anybody coming with them, or is it just them leaving on their own?
No, we evacuated the White Russian armies. So Denikin's army was evacuated almost in its entirety.
Okay.
First to Crimea, where it's made its last stand, and then later on out to Turkey and a Greek island. Quite a lot of troops spent time on the Greek island, but anyway, basically everybody got out. In the north, the Russian army refused to go. We strongly, Ironside strongly recommended them to move up to Murmansk, which is it's an all-weather. It's a port that operates year-round. It doesn't freeze up like Archangel. Easier to defend, and evacuation would be possible, even in winter. And the Russian leader there, a man called Miller, he refuses, and ends up doing exactly what Ironside feared he would do, which is disappearing off, leaving most of his army behind, stuck down the rivers and the railway to be captured by the Reds. So, I mean, and civilians are not, I mean, civilians are actually, they're given passages in some cases, but they generally have to buy a ticket. So it's the middle classes who get away. But they're generally doing it under their own steam. I mean, people see which way the wind is blowing, and they simply, commercial vessels are still going back and forth across the Black Sea to Constantinople as well. So, I mean, a lot of people just get themselves out under their own steam, or they go east. A lot of people end up in China, in sort of Harbin and Shanghai.
Yeah, it's sorry, there's just been some questions about, if there's a impact of these people leaving. I don't think like cultural impact, because I don't think it's enough. It doesn't seem like there's a large number of people leaving.
Well, I mean, in that period, and then it was possible still to get permission to leave sort of the first few years of the 20s. I mean, a few million Russians do leave, but America and Britain are stingy with visas.
Yeah, well,
they mostly end up in Germany or France, or indeed China.
Yeah.
So they do have a cultural impact there, and particularly, of course, in Germany, where these white Russian exiles, the Jew equals Bolshevik.
Yeah.
Trope feeds into Nazi ideology, because these very right-wing Russian emigre organizations team up. They're friendly with the Nazis.
Yeah.
And that definitely feeds into to Nazi anti-Semitism.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's just, you can, obviously we know this, but you can see the threads, where this is going to go with a lot of the same language, and also what's going to happen to the Soviet Union. It's a seemingly, I don't know, foreshadowing in a lot of ways. And if you're looking at it that way, of the more suffering that's coming. And it's,
but I mean, there's also a lot of, I mean, unpolitical or moderate figures who end up in the West. I mean, Rachmaninoff, and there is. I mean, it does as a Diaghilev and people. It does have a big sort of emigre Russia in general, not white Russia, as in not it has a it does have a big cultural influence. After the revolution, in the 20s and 30s, particularly, I'd say.
Yeah. So, kind of wrapping up as we move to the end here. Kind of hoping with writing this book and trying to tell this story, I was kind of hoping what, I don't know, depends on the levels of what people can do, but is what your hopes are this book will do. I was wondering if you had kind of a thought of what you're kind of hoping what could come from this book, and given what's going on right now, it's hard not to think about that too, right?
What I very much hope will not people will not be left with by my book is the idea that because intervention failed back then, that helping Ukraine now will fail, and is a bad idea. This is the war. Russia's war against Ukraine is not a civil war, and the Ukrainians are very much not the sort of inept and reactionary whites. And I mean, I make this point every time I'm asked to speak about the book. The white cause. The white cause was never viable. Actually, one of the major reasons it wasn't viable was because of the white attitude towards the non-Russian nationalities, which you see echoed exactly now in Kremlin propaganda and in Russia's attitude to Ukraine. So the national arm, had the whites conceded independence or even just autonomy to the new Baltic national governments, the Finns, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Georgians, they'd have very likely won the civil war. And instead of a communist Russia, we'd have seen a sort of an authoritarian right-wing Russia, which would have been better. But it wouldn't have been great, but it would certainly have been better than Stalin. But the idea of conceding anything to the non-Russian nationalities, these new national governments, was absolute anathema to people like Denikin and Kolchak in Siberia and so on. They viewed Russia as one and indivisible. That's what they were fighting for. Russia one and indivisible.
Right.
And people, non-Russians who wanted to go their own ways were traitors. And it's exactly that, and it's exactly that mindset, that visceral feeling of ownership, of identification with empire. Without empire, not really you. Without Ukraine, Russia isn't really Russia. I mean, Putin, explicitly says this. He says Ukraine doesn't really exist. Ukrainians are really Russians, and Kiev is one of the mother cities of Russia. Yeah. And that absolutely echoes down the centuries, and it's sort of, and one hopes that Putin will fall for some of the same reasons, for rather the same reason that the Whites did, because of his total inability to let go of this idea of Russia as an empire, it being absolutely vital to Russia that it ruled other non-Russian peoples, whatever they want, what their feelings about it, irrelevant. It belongs to us.
Right.
I'm in Ireland now on holiday, and I was talking to a history festival here in Cork about it, doing a little talk there a couple of weeks ago, and I said that talking actually even to liberal Russians, liberal Russian friends today, Putin hating Russians, about Ukraine, it's like talking to British Tories, about Ireland.
Okay, yeah.
3 and a bit ago. It's just that feeling of ownership. It's like part of us. It's part of our country. And whether these Irish nationalists, they sort of they've just had a sort of brainstorm. They've been sort of seized by madness.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels there. It's so fascinating, that you make that connection of empire and identity. That's a fascinating one because you can't not think about the other side here, right? Saying again, the other side of the Reds, the communists, Bolsheviks, and how they unify it through more blood, which is another part of this, right? But they are seeing this as an international revolution.
Well, he's used all this language of brotherhood of nations and internationalism, and also until the end of the 20s, the different Soviet republics have quite a good deal of dependence. It's Moscow that calls the shots, but culturally speaking, there's a big revival of the non-Russian languages of Ukrainian and Georgian and so on, and education is encouraged and publishing is encouraged, and the elites of it's non-Russian elites who are in charge of the first party secretaries in the different republics and so on. So, and then that is squashed, basically with Stalin, and you have these massive purges, and everything's brought right back under Moscow control, and Russification again, and so they ended up in the same place as the Whites would have done, but they did it more cleverly. They were able to trim, they were able to make compromises. Much clever, obviously, with their messaging and their propaganda. They had they were much less. They were much cleverer. They were just much better than the Whites. They were impressive, and they were horrible, but they were impressive people.
Well, I think it comes from the background, right, of having to be political operators in the shadows, right, for so long. I think but that could just be me projecting, but that seems like they had more experience.
Well, it's extraordinary. One has some sympathy even with Churchill, because on paper it looked as though they would last a minute. They'd been exiled sort of pamphleteers, for years until they took power. They had no political experience. Nobody had ever heard of them, not in Russia or abroad.
True.
And then for ages, all they held on to really was, clutch of cities in the centre, and all the rest of the map looked white, But it became it became apparent to all the interventionists on the ground that this, that the maps were misleading,
Right.
And the whites were probably a lost cause, pretty quickly, and we took too long to acknowledge this.
Yeah. Okay. So I think, well, that's thoroughly complicated, and it's complicated now more by having you on. So, well, I appreciate that, because knowing how many moving parts there are in your book, which there are links to purchase it in the description down below, so everyone can check those out. It's fantastic to get you to talk about this, because this is an area, again, I'm still fascinated by. I mean, obviously there's a small Canadian connection for me, but it just has this current implications. It has implications through other areas of history that's, I know, so many of us are interested in, right? The comparisons to World War II are, and where that leads is inevitable to make. So thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it, and having the opportunity to ask you questions about this. Kind of one last question for me is, what's working on anything next?
I'm doing Ukraine stuff. I'm doing sort of Ukraine journalism and going there regularly. I'm leaving the past behind for a while.
Well, I guess so. Those of us history nerds always want to stay in the past, but I guess some of us have to move forward. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming on, and thank you, Anna, for coming on. Did you enjoy coming on the channel? It wasn't too hard on you? I hope
it was fantastic. No, it's a bit nerve-wracking being live.
Oh, nah, you get.
I'm used to these podcasters who sort of edit you into glorious articulacy and coherence, when you're done. But there you go. You're getting me unedited.
That's what we do. I don't like it stuffy. I don't like it too formal. We gotta.
No, it's great, and in fact, and fantastic questions from the listeners as well. So thank you.
Yeah. So thanks everyone. Some more stuff will be coming up shortly in the channel. So just keep an eye on that. Still gotta nail down some details, but other than that, everyone have a good rest of your Thursday wherever you happen to be, and see you next time. Bye, everybody.